So, in the spotlight this week, COVID with the Premier League. A lot of people are now questioning the motives of the Premier League, what kind of ways that they're handling it. Is it right? I mean, Ben, can you start us off with the situation as it is with Leicester and Tottenham before we kind of get into any discussions?
Yeah, so as it currently stands at the time of recording, we know that Tottenham are currently without 13 members of their team. That's 8 first-team players and 5 members of the backroom staff. Now, Antonio Conte, quite rightly, is very unhappy, to say the least, with regards to the situation. They are training ahead of their Europa Conference League game. But players are being tested on a daily basis, and this is something that will evolve, will develop, and their game against Brighton this weekend is in serious doubt. And with regards to Leicester, they're also playing in the Europa League on Thursday night. Now, Brendan Rodgers said that he was without 7 players as it currently stands. However, he wouldn't go into specifics. All he said, it was a mixture of illness and COVID-related absence.
And so, just before we get into the analysis as well, I do want to say from all of us here, the Premier Injury podcast, we hope that the players, their families, whatever happens there, that they recover quickly. That's the most important thing. And that's why we're kind of talking about this as well, because so far the track record has been quite good with the Premier League. There hasn't been too many outbreaks. But I guess, maybe throwing it to you, Raj, is enough being done? How can this be managed going forward? Because there seems to almost be an unspoken situation at the moment that Tottenham are almost implicated that they have to play. We know UEFA have had a no-nonsense approach. Is it unfair, this kind of way going forward?
Yes. I understand it from the perspective of, I think yes and no. Yes, it is unfair because you're missing 8 players, right? And so it's very, very difficult to do it. At the same time, every team is facing the same circumstances, right? So in that case, should, let's say, Brighton be punished for another team having an outbreak or whatever, for whatever reason, right? And so that's the question to me. It's going to be punitive to them as well, because let's say they move that game. Now, if it's shoehorned in between 2 other games for them or whatever it is, right? And you're messing with their schedule as well. And so that to me is really the question. Is there any right answer? Not really. So I think it's a really, really tough situation to be in for any of these teams. I think the question really becomes, the teams have to figure out why and how, wherever the root cause is, and how to figure out and how to stop that moving forward.
Looking at, I don't want to make this about club rivalries or anything, but Arsenal were in a very similar situation at the start of the season. And I remember we actually did do a podcast on this at the time. Ben, you were very kind of stringent on it. You said, look, Arsenal, Tottenham, all these clubs have a big enough squad that even if there is an outbreak of COVID, they could field their under 21s, whatever. It's just fair for the situation. Arsenal did have to go into the games at the start of the season with those problems at hand. I mean, Ben, do you think it would be even more unfair to kind of change it after the rules have been enforced as such up until now?
I mean, it's difficult because we do have a precedent that was set last year. I think it was 6 Premier League games that were called off, if I recall correctly. Villa, Newcastle, City, Everton, Tottenham, Fulham, all involved in games. And you're right with regards to UEFA in those Europa ties. I think they stipulate as long as you have 13 fit senior players plus a goalkeeper, you play the game. There's a little bit more flexibility and leniency with the FA and the Premier League with regards to that. But for me as well, and I get this quite a lot, is the game off? Will it be postponed? You're compromising the competition. But I look at Brighton and I look at Watford, for example. For the majority of game weeks this season, Watford have had between 8 and 10 players out, for every single game due to injury, non-COVID related absence. Brighton, everybody's focused on Tottenham here, but Brighton currently have 9 players at risk of missing out this weekend. Where are the cries that, where these players, postpone it on their behalf. And yes, it's a very difficult situation to manage, but, I think we need to consider the wider picture and understand as well. We're looking at some of those players involved in that Tottenham team. Dane Scarlett, one of them on the fringes of that first team, a non-starter. Christian Romero, he's also injured and out until the new year. Leicester, Benkovic is one of those ones who's sidelined, hasn't even featured in the matchday squad. So, you know what, the numbers are headline grabbers. That's what everybody says, but it needs to be given a little bit of context, and clubs, understand the situation. It's 11 playing field, and while it's a Leicester or a Tottenham this game week, it could quite easily be an Aston Villa, a Newcastle, a City, or a United down the line. And I think it's, like I say, it's the league are right not to have a blanket decision or a course of action, and they treat each request on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, kind of bringing it to again, one of the guests that we had on, the fantastic Chris Miller from the Extra Inch podcast, but his point kind of reflecting almost what Antonio Conte said as well. They're kind of running a hashtag to care is to do. And they're saying that Tottenham should make the decision to cancel these games. Why put Rennes players at risk? Why put Brighton players at risk? And maybe for them to almost take the hit, or maybe take a stand. And I guess that moves it from the maybe economic or footballing standpoint of, it's going to disrupt the schedule and it's going to cause problems for teams. But there's the human element as well. These people have families. They could have relatives that are maybe more risk adverse to getting COVID or whatever. I mean, where does that come into the reckoning, Raj?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and you wish that was, you wish that would be the priority, right, from the get-go, but in reality, it's not. And so, I just feel like, personally, any team, if you do have COVID-19 and you have enough players to meet that standard, the responsibility should fall on the team who has it, right, not on anyone else to adapt to that, first and foremost, right? And so I completely agree with that statement. It should come from that team looking out first and foremost for their own players in that regard.
So for both of you, do you think Tottenham should maybe make the call, cancel the Rennes game, cancel the Brighton game? I mean, Ben, do you want to give a quick answer on that one?
Look, we're seeing something in black and white here, and we all know that's not the case. External influence and factors, there will be ramifications for any decision that's made, penalised, penalties. If Tottenham may see this as an opportunity as their only way to qualify for the Europa League next season, by winning this conference competition. Now, would the chairman be looking at that and thinking, well, I need you to go out there and at least try and make it count? Because ultimately, this comes down to pounds and pence. This is money, and while it may not be the Champions League, is the Europa League then an opportunity for the following season to get into the Champions League? So look, it's all well and good and playing the martyr and standing up there and saying we'll do this and do that, but it's not just about a game of football. It's much bigger than that. It's a wider situation, and rarely can these be taken, like I say, purely in black and white. There are a lot of considerations to be made which will muddy the waters.
I mean, Raj, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I completely agree. I mean, like we talked on the other previous podcast with the injuries. If injuries and player health was the priority, we wouldn't have a Christmas season in the Premier League. We wouldn't have multiple condensed schedules in the Premier League. We wouldn't have a Winter World Cup in Qatar. And so the evidence, the trend line is obvious. And so, and like Ben said, the key point, why is it only the case when it's COVID? How about these other teams who are so negatively impacted by injuries? Is it fine just to normalize those, right? And not consider those as extenuating circumstances as well? That, to me, we have to consider all these other notions. It's very, very on a spectrum of gray. It's not that black and white.
I guess, from my opinion, the difference between an injury crisis and a COVID crisis is that a COVID crisis puts everybody's health at risk. It's transmissible. It's not something for the individual. And so, say if they did, and it has been proven so far that some of the COVID testing, that there's such a margin of error, it's very minuscule, but it can happen. If that player goes out, plays against Rennes, and then Rennes gets infected, I mean, you're potentially putting people's lives at risk. But that's the kind of concluding point there on that discussion point. I mean, we talked in the last video, Raj, about America's kind of way of handling in their sports about injury situation, schedules, whatever. Does that make it easier? Does American sport have a different way of managing COVID crises as well?
So I believe it's sport to sport. I think in the NFL, if you can't field a certain amount of players, you forfeit the game. It's pretty much black and white in that regard. And so they're very, very strict. They also have, I believe, stricter rules on unvaccinated players, especially in the NFL. NBA does not, but they have ongoing protocols. So there really hasn't been a big breakout yet in the NBA. You'll see, one player here or there, but it's not these. Maybe I think the most I've seen up in the NBA was 3 or 4 players, but it hasn't been the 6, 7, 8 plus staff backroom. I can't remember what the exact protocol is in the NBA if you can't field the players. I do still think that you might just forfeit the game. I believe I'm not certain, but again, it's just a harder line stance. I believe the NFL has been by far the most stringent in terms of their protocols and saying, hey, if you're unvaccinated, you can't do X, Y, and Z. If you don't have enough players, you're just going to forfeit the game. That it is what it is.
That's a fascinating insight there. Final maybe question is, we're 19 months into this pandemic. Has people's habits changed? I mean, even from a league perspective, Ben, do you think that people are becoming a little bit more relaxed, maybe pushing the limits a little bit more, going out, doing this? Or is it the flip side, maybe coming from above? We don't want to get into politics, but the message has been for a while now to be as normal as possible. What is your kind of thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you cast your mind back to maybe the beginning of Project Restart, when we were thinking about starting the Premier League and the protocols that we had in place then, of course, players were unvaccinated at the time, but you had players arriving individually, so there was no teammates, players who were driving in their kits, ready for the game. There was a minimal amount of time spent indoors. Wherever possible, it was outside. You couldn't enter the building without temperature checks and filling in health questionnaires. They were receiving daily reminders on protocol for COVID. There was, if you wanted to see the physio, which was a set time, a maximum of 15 minutes, or you wanted to go to the gym, you had to book a time slot and you had to clean down all your machines. But as time moves on and those sort of practices shift a little bit, and like you say, it's around normalizing, your life and living with the virus. And I just think it's human nature to almost relax and fall into this comfort zone and sometimes move out of your bubble. And of course, we don't know that any of this has happened. You can pick up COVID, from anywhere. So we're not suggesting that these players have done anything wrong. It can just happen anyway. But I just think human nature in itself, lends itself to maybe just a relaxing of your own, stringent measures to try and stay as safe as possible.
And I guess, is there anything to add to that then, Raj? Because I think it's an important point there that Ben has said that, in probably a lot of these situations, everybody was following what the protocols of the time are. They've worked within the rules. They've not done anything too silly. It's just that they've gone out. But again, there is also that human element where maybe 2 or 3 months ago, 6 months ago, they might have not gone to this place or might not have hugged that individual. They might have done, one of the silly fist pumps that we've all had to do. But now that's kind of almost died down a little bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a term called pandemic fatigue, right? Where people are just tired of something. So it's like, oh, maybe I won't, be as stringent with my how protective I am of some of those things. And the other aspect, just from a scientific perspective, is that now you have Delta variant, which we know is much easier to spread than the previous variants, right? Omicron, we don't know yet, which is the newest one. But with Delta, much easier to spread, much higher viral load. You see more kids getting it, which is a way for it to spread. Whereas before, that really wasn't that big of an issue, right? And so that brings with it, along with some of these loosening of our protections, right? It's again, it's an intersection of not a perfect storm, but it's certainly a storm that leads to a higher rate of infections and a higher rate of spread.
And so with that, that is the last on this week's double in terms of it, Premier Injuries podcast. We done a special because there was two massive kind of talking points, and also it's Christmas time, so we thought we'd give you an extra gift of, you know, the presence of Ben and Raj. People aren't tuning in for me at all. So in terms of it, then I wish everybody the best of health, the best of luck during this time as well. And we will see you again next week. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because we're here every Thursday, and we will see you again very, very soon.